Hello, Dominic here from the Bournemouth Writing Festival. Welcome to another chat with a local author. Now, we're coming to the end of this chat series, so I hope that you have enjoyed our chats with lots of different authors, writers and writing professionals. Please do subscribe using the subscribe button underneath, because we will be publishing more videos as we lead up to the Writing Festival that's happening in April. Now, you may have seen in the last few days or weeks, we announced a romance writing festival, which is going to be happening in Bournemouth in October 2025. And today I'm absolutely delighted because we've got a romance writer joining me today to have a little chat about romance. So Nikki Moore, who's going to be joining me, writes under lots of different pen names, and we're going to be talking about that in a minute. But she has published different books under different pen names, primarily under romance and women's fiction. Some of her books have been on the best-selling list on Amazon. One of her books, The Last Charm, was published by an imprint of HarperCollins. And her short story was included in the best-selling Mills and Boon anthology, which was in association with the Romance Novelists Association. She's also been shortlisted for many, many awards, which I won't go into because this video would be far too long. So please welcome Nikki.
Thanks, Dominic. I'm not quite sure how to top that intro, but I appreciate you being here. I'm a massive fan and supporter of Bournemouth Writing Festival. I've been 2 years in a row now, and I'm really delighted to hear about the announcement of the Romance Writing Festival. It's a genre that's often overlooked or pigeonholed in certain ways, but we've seen a real increase in popularity, particularly over the last 18 months to 2 years. And I think some of the ways in which it's being pigeonholed are starting to shift. So it's feeling great to walk into bookshops and see romance sections almost front and centre rather than tucked away at the back.
Well, I shall chat to you about that in just a second, as well as all those post-it notes that are behind you. So that looks like a process of your writing. But to begin with, what I really want to ask you, and I'm fascinated because I do ask, when I find out that people write under different pen names, I always ask why, because I think it's fascinating because of all the different reasons why people do it. So, Nikki, why do you write under different pen names?
Yeah, there's a couple of different reasons. So let's work through them. So first of all, my aunt is Sue Moorcroft, who is a Sunday Times best-selling author. There's something, I don't know what it is, something in the family about writing and reading. So Sue started doing quite well a few years before I was published. And when I was offered my first proper book contract, we were talking about the names that I published under. And I felt really passionate about, I didn't want people thinking there was some kind of nepotism or I was, riding on her coattails. So actually, I didn't want to publish under Moorcroft. That was one of the reasons. I wanted my own kind of identity as an author. The other thing is that at the time I was working for a local authority in quite a sensitive job, dealing with employees. And I wouldn't want anybody to ever think that I was kind of mining their life for inspiration for my stories. So I also wanted a bit of separation with that as well. So Nikki came from, my first name is Veronique, and when I was 15, I worked in a cafe and they just could not say my name. And they ended up saying, you can either be Nikki or you can be Ron. And I was like, Nikki sounds nicer. So I'll go for Nikki. And then I was choosing between Moore and Croft. And I thought Nikki Croft sounded like a crime writer, which I will circle back round to actually. So Nikki Moore was born basically for the romance writing. I published most of my books under that pen name, sort of the Love London series and my debut, which was called Crazy Undercover Love. When I was asked to write The Last Charm, we felt it had a different tone to my other books. My other books were much more kind of contemporary romance or rom-com, and The Last Charm is very much, it's commercial women's fiction. It's kind of an epic love story set in Dorset, which we can again talk about later. So really, it was an amalgamation of all those things. And I'm also halfway through writing a psychological, can't talk, thriller. And it will probably be a different pen name again, because again, I think it's about your audience expect certain things from you. So you have to think about, how do you put yourself in the market? What do people expect from you? So yeah, not a short answer.
So so does that mean then you choose different genres per pen name? So if Ella Albright is one genre, Nikki Moore is another, and then this psychological thriller that you're writing. So, because I know that if somebody wants to read a Dan Brown book, they know exactly what they're getting. They're not going to get a rom-com off Dan Brown. So is that kind of why you're going down that route?
It is. It's primarily about what your audience expects from you, kind of, and also how the market positions you. It is interesting because up until about 2 years ago, I'd say that most people, they were picking a different pen name per genre. However, we have started to see mainstream authors, selling in one genre are actually taking their names with them into something totally different. So, for instance, Lisa Jewell is a prime example. She wrote and published kind of back when she was starting out, it was called chick lit, but it's contemporary romance. And then she's completely switched. Her Lisa Jewell books over the last 3, 4, 5 years are psychological thriller kind of crime. So she actually kept her pen name, and a few others have done that, like Adele Parks. So there's a bit of a shift in the industry. And to be honest, I think it's down to the publisher or the agent you're with and what they think the best direction is for the career. And I think it's also about the size of your name, like how I think the more well-known you are, the more it's possible to probably hang on to that name and, take audiences with you. I think if you're less well-known, I think you've got to have the differentiation.
So you mentioned in the first part of your answer about with your day job and not people not feeling like you've mined their stories. But then what happens when they find out, oh, you're this author and you've got all these books? Then is there a potential conflict there?
I've always been really mindful of that because I work in human resources. So, it is about people at the end of the day. It's not that I've ever hidden it. I'll say to people, I'm a published author and I publish under pen names. I've never had that happen. So I've never had anyone turn around to me and say, oh, well, you were supporting my case, 3 years ago, and therefore I've read your book and I think that you've used as part of it. I've always been really, really careful. Of course, there's a bit of me in every character. There's always a little something, whether it's a personality trait or something that I love to do or a certain way of seeing the world. My inspirations always come from I was actually at a writing festival on Saturday, which is why my voice is a little bit hoarse. We were talking about writing inspiration. I was chairing a panel with other authors, and we were talking about where we get ideas from. And to a certain degree, we're all kind of the same, that we all kind of take lots of different things from our own lives and maybe people we know, but it's also it's music, it's other books, it's films, it's what's in the news. So it's kind of pulling little bits together. But I've always been really, really careful to keep my professional day job very separate to my writing. The only link I've ever really had between the two is in my debut romance, Crazy Undercover Love. There is an employment tribunal mentioned. So I used my technical knowledge of tribunals and cases, but I was very careful not to use anything like that there would be a similar case or situation, or that any of the employees I was supporting would recognise themselves, because I didn't use them or their situations. But yeah, I haven't had a problem navigating it so far.
And that's exactly what happened with me with my second book, is that I created a character that was an amalgamation of lots of different people. And I was explicit in my acknowledgements to say, I want to thank all the people, because they were people that I spoke to when I volunteered at the Bournemouth Food Bank. But yeah, you couldn't easily identify anybody by saying, oh, that's that person or that's that person.
Yeah, it is a difficult balance to tread, and obviously as authors we've got to be really, really responsible when we're writing, and we don't obviously want to end up on the wrong end of a lawsuit. It's not good for anyone. So yeah, I think it is about making sure it's not recognizable, and I definitely would never take anyone I'd never take anyone wholesale and use them. Now again, I mentioned this in the festival on Saturday, but in my Love London series, which has got 5 novellas, there is a cameo towards the end of every novella. One of my close friends is in a cameo role, but I explicitly said to them, would you like to have a part in my story? And I said, I'd use your first name and kind of how you look and your traits. And they absolutely had the choice to go, I don't want to be in a cameo. But surprise, surprise, they're all like, yes, put me in your book. So I have cameoed people that I know, but only with explicit consent and permission. And they don't, that they're very much, it's a secondary character that kind of wanders in the background for maybe a minute or even 30 seconds. But other than that, yeah, you've got to be very careful. You don't want it to be someone picks up the book, reads it and goes, I know this is me because. I was talking to an author over the weekend who's very bemused I think she's an author that's well known in a local area, was down the pub one day and a man came up to her and said, I've read your latest book and I think that's me. And she basically said, well, out loud, I kind of went, oh, well, maybe, and kind of gave a nod. And she said, in my head, I was thinking, but, my character's really good looking and he plays the guitar and he does all this. And she said, I don't understand why he was saying that's me. She said, because in my head, it wasn't him and they weren't similar at all. So I think sometimes people get a kick out of, appearing in books or thinking they are. And actually, I have seen something over the weekend where I think there was an author running a competition saying to people who wants to have their name appear in a book, or who would like to be killed off in my next book. So yeah, it's funny. It's funny.
I think you're right that some people absolutely want to be in the book. So my third book, there's I put a character's surname in, and which was my real friends, and he was absolutely delighted that he was in it. So yes, you're right. As long as they're not the villain, I think you're fine. So Nikki, I want to talk about your process of writing, and everyone can see your post-it notes, very colorful. It looks like it's very organized. You're obviously a planner rather than a pantser. So why don't you explain your process when you're writing your novels?
Yeah, sure. It's changed massively over the years, actually. So when I first started out, the first book that I ever wrote, it was 130,000 words long, and it needed to be about 90,000. So I massively overwrote. And I didn't plan at all. I kind of had an idea in my head, the beginning and the end. I had no idea how I was going to get there. So massively overwrote, and it was really painful having to then go back and kind of strip it down and decide kind of what subplots or what came out, or maybe I was just waffling and 3 pages of description when I only needed 1 paragraph. I also had another book that I wrote. I wrote about 50,000 words and got to the end, and that was it. I'd run out of story, and I was like, oh, this is very, very light. So it was really, my planning started really coming to the forefront when I was writing The Last Charm. So my editor, Charlotte, at One More Chapter, who, as she says, part of HarperCollins, she basically had an idea around, she'd had a relative that had a charm bracelet. And so I went up to London and met with her, and she basically said, I'd love to do an epic love story set around a charm bracelet. And I kind of went, well, how much poetic license have I got? And she was like, well, as much as you want. It's just that there's got to be a charm bracelet, and we'll have a main male character and a female main character. So so we had a very brief chat. I was really passionate about wanting it to be set in Dorset. A lot of publishers basically say Dorset's only for cozy crime. And I was like, no, I'm going to show that Dorset's beautiful and it can totally work as a backdrop for romance. We had a very short chat about it. I went away, and I think because we'd agreed that I'd write this book and she gave me a deadline, I had to be very disciplined. I've always written around a full-time day job. I really needed to be clear how I was going to get to the word count and write this story. So I went for a process of deciding what would the charms be on the bracelet, what special meaning would they have. I knew I was going to do it from 2 viewpoints, so Layla and Jake are the main characters, and I basically started plotting out. I think it's the first time I really built like something that you can see behind me, although this has evolved over time. This is much smarter than it was back then. So I kind of went, X number of charms, 1 viewpoint per chapter, and I kind of started to have key milestones. But over the last 3 or 4 years, I've written another 3 books since then. I've read a couple of craft books, which really, really helped me. One of them is, I'm just trying to look for the title. It's Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which was originally a screenwriting book. It talks about story beats, and there's some really clear guidelines around the story beats and kind of percentages and when you expect things to happen in stories. And this is where the storyboard that you see behind me is born. So I basically have, you won't be able to see it, but I've basically got a line along the bottom which has got percentages as a number of words, and then I start to kind of anchor out the point. This is the midpoint, this is the inciting incident, this last 25% of the book's got to be about this. And then I basically, I use post-its to start to break down the viewpoints, the locations, the chapters. And then once I've done all that up on a wall, I put it down in a spreadsheet. There's a spreadsheet as well. And that's where I start to build a bit more detail as to what will happen in each chapter. And also the research that I need to do. So I used to be very much researching as I'm writing, and that would get in the way of the actual writing, because you're writing it, you suddenly starting to think, I need to know about this date back then on this location. stops your flow. You dive into a black hole on Google, takes you an hour to kind of pull yourself back out of it. So I'm much more structured than I used to be. I find it really useful. I have authors that I know that are horrified at this that I do. Something's just happened in the background where I can see fireworks. I'm not sure what's happening there.
I don't know what happened there. We're celebrating.
Celebrating my writing process being a lot more defined. What was I saying? So I have author friends who are horrified at the idea of this because they feel like it's too rigid and too structured. My view is I might know going into a chapter largely what needs to happen, so I know whose viewpoint it's written from. I'll know the kind of the key points. Where do I need to get to by the end of a scene? But it doesn't mean that I know line by line how my characters are going to get there. So for me, there's enough structure that I can write quickly and feel like I've achieved something, but it's still organic in terms of the emotions, the description, the dialogue, the way that characters interact with each other. But what I would say is that everybody's absolutely unique. What works for me and works really well now, and this has helped me write quite quickly, other people would not be able to get along with at all. Other people just need to do seat of the pants writing, and that works for them. So whenever I talk at festivals or conferences, or sometimes I kind of mentor other writers, I always say you need to find whatever it is that suits you, that enables you to write in the way that you want to. But I love this, and I like colours as well, and stationery. I've got a stationery addiction.
I think W.H. Smith loves you. So that's really interesting. And you're right, everybody has a different way of doing things. But within this structure that you have, I know you said it's not like completely like 100% fixed, but how much wiggle room do you give yourself? Because let's say you're within a chapter and you're writing, but then you kind of think, oh, this character's going this way. Is it flexible enough for you to change some things down the line? Or is it very much, this is where I've got to begin my chapter and that's where I've got to end my chapter?
That's a really interesting question, Dominic. And the answer is sometimes I don't know. There are times definitely where something happens that's a bit unexpected. And what I normally then do is I've got 2 beagles. I take them for a walk and I just have some thinking time. So I'm not typing and I'm not at my laptop, but I'm out in the fresh air and I'm kind of ruminating. And what I ask myself is what the character's trying to do. Because you'll know from writing, even though these characters are being made up by you and the stories are in your head, it often feels like the characters are kind of separate from you and they are individual people doing their own thing. But I basically ask myself, is this the way that this story needs to go? And does it make sense if I continue that way? And I've definitely made tweaks to storylines, and I've definitely kind of, maybe rather than going straight from point A to B, I've kind of gone A, B sort of thing. There's a little bit of extra, but fundamentally it's about what it works for the story. I definitely wouldn't be rigid in terms of saying, right, just because I've got the storyboard saying this, then I've got to stick to it. So yeah, it's about what makes sense, and I need that time away from it often to have a think about, and if I do this, what's the knock-on effect on all the other storylines? Does it mean I've then got to completely restructure the last third of my book? And then I have to, as a writer, you're often thinking, and sometimes you don't know to get to the end of the book, but what's the theme of the story? What am I ultimately trying to say? So then that's that bit around restructuring. Does that work with that theme, or is it going to change the book entirely? What I'd also say, though, is that I've heard writers call it all sorts of things, but I call it the dirty draft. So my first draft is littered with mistakes. I put big X's, I'll put kind of in capitals, come back here and, have a think about this or insert research. So the first draft is never intended to be shown to anyone. First draft is, there was a really famous author, I can't remember who said it, but the first draft is, I'm telling the story to myself. When I then redraft, it's about me telling it to other people and polishing. And it's on those kind of subsequent redrafts that I'll then start going, right, that character went off piece, this is where I went, was that the right thing to do? Do I need to bring it back? Or does it work much better now because I've given them free rein and I've diverged from, whatever my original plan was?
So a lot of the people that I talk to within the writing festival, they have their finished draft, they've done it. It's like they're happy with it. and then it's trying to find an agent. So you've kind of gone past that line, if you like. So give us a little peek behind the curtain for you. What happened when you finished your draft and then you started to query?
Yeah, so I've had a bit of an interesting journey with agents. So I was being courted by an agent back in 2015, which was when I was a finalist in the Joan Hessian Award. So when we talk about the RNA, I'm talking about the Romantic Novelist Association, which is a UK-based writing association, primarily for romance authors, but also industry professionals as well. So agents, publishers can be associate members, and there's also a probationary membership scheme, which is called the New Writer Scheme, which is what I came up through. So that's an amazing association, and they've definitely helped me on my journey. So the first agent I was being courted by, I met at an RNA event. My debut novel was a finalist in an award. I ended up going to meet with her in London. It was amazing. It's the kind of stuff that, you know, way before you're published, you kind of dream about. Ultimately, I didn't sign with her. There was a direction she wanted my career to go in, and it wasn't the direction I wanted. My actual agent that I had up until about a year and a bit ago, she was moving agencies, and I'd run into her at an RNA party, and I don't want people watching this to think that, you know, there's a lot around the industry about that, you know, if you don't live in London, you can't, you know, you're not part of kind of the clique of the industry. And it just so happens that, you know, it's the RNA events that it's because you just get talking to people, but that could just as well be over an online event or somewhere up north. But yeah, we got chatting. I think she'd read one of my Love London novellas. She was moving agencies. I popped her an email. Again, I ended up going to London to meet with her. We had a really good chat, and I was with her for 3 or 4 years. We parted ways last year. She basically had a lot of clients, and she needed to kind of thin the list right down. So I've actually been back in Aquarian trenches as an author with a track record for the last year and a bit, and it is very tough. And even with a track record, I've had full of manuscripts pulled in. I've had quite a few different calls now with agents, but I haven't found the right fit. And I'm very passionate when it comes to agents. I think there's lots of different ways you can go. Some people that I know have never had an agent and they don't want one or need one. Some people like me have had an agent or two and are now unagented, and then they're going to stay that way. Some people really want one because their expertise, you know, the contacts they have, the publishers that they can get into you into that you can't. You know, some publishers they won't take unagented submissions. So, you know, there's a variety of different ways that you can go. I'm very much, I'd rather be single than be in a relationship I'm not happy with. And so for me, finding the right agent is really, really important. So querying is tough. There's no doubt about it. You have to really be prepared for long wait times. You have to have a really thick skin. You have to be really resilient. The way that I deal with the waiting, because I'm quite an impatient person, is I just keep writing, and I try to kind of put that out of my mind as much as possible. Having a writing tribe as well is incredibly important. So having a network of people who, you know, who either they might be published or they might not be published, but they've started their writing journey. Having people that you can talk to who are in that, you know, with you is a really, really important part of trying to, you know, either to become a published author or stay one. So I haven't got any magic wand that I can wave. In terms of querying agents, I have had quite an unusual journey because actually this is the first time I've actually had to send query letters out. So it's been illuminating.
So I think it's really fascinating and so brave that when you first started to answer that question, you said, like, I found an agent, or an agent wanted me, but they weren't the right fit for me. And I think that's incredible, because so many people, like, if you get an agent, be like jumping up and down saying, I've got an agent, and not even thinking whether they're the right person. It's kind of having that validation, and that the gatekeeper finally saying, we think you're good enough to be published. And even in my mind, I wouldn't even thought that agent might not be the right person. And I hear you met them, and you probably had those conversations, you probably felt uneasy, but it's great for you to have that within you to say, do you know what, this isn't right, rather than somebody who maybe is a little bit more desperate to go, I want an agent, I've got an agent, and then take you down a path which you might not want to go down?
I think it's about being strategic. So, I mean, I started writing seriously to try and get published in 2010. And I had a couple of competition entries. I was first published in 2004. Sorry, just thinking back. Offered my first book deal in 2013, first published in 2014. And even 10 years in, I still feel like I've got a lot to learn, and I'm learning all the time. And I'm always very honest and open about that. But I've always been very strategic, and it might be because of my day job in human resources, and especially I'm at a senior management level now, where you have to really start thinking more strategically and longer term. I just feel quite passionate about, you know, if you've got an agent, you've got to be on the same page about where you want your career to go. And you're right, you know, some people might just go, I want an agent above all else, and they would sign with them, go with the agent. But then they might find that a year or two down the line, they might part ways with the agent. I think it's also about, you know, it might be that I speak to agents and I'm not the right fit for them. It might not always be me that's saying, oh, I'm not sure if this feels entirely right. And it's not really about feeling uneasy. It's just about, I think it's a bit like dating. It's like, you know, when you know, you know, if it's the right kind of person, you've got the same kind of values, the same kind of, you're both on the same page, you kind of know. And when that's not happening, I think you also know. I think what's been important for me, though, I've also had book deals that I was offered, and I've turned down book deals for the same reasons. Two of them were really early on in my career. And of course, there's always a little part of me that goes, oh, was that a silly thing to do? But at the time, I've always approached, so I think I've turned down 3 book deals altogether over the last kind of 10 years. And it's been when I've been thinking around, well, what is it they're offering me? What is it they're expecting from me? But also, what are some of the clauses in a contract? And these kinds of things aren't talked enough about by authors. There's a real lack of transparency in the publishing industry. And I'm quite passionate about trying to demystify it for people. So because I haven't got an agent at the moment, I'm a member of the Society of Authors, who are basically, you know, the union for authors. So yeah, it's been a mixture of things. But in each of those scenarios, I've just been thinking strategically, is this the best thing? Am I happy that the contract, you know, there is a good balance in the relationship between me and the publisher? Am I happy that the clauses feel proportionate? And I do think that's where my HR background comes in a bit, that, you know, looking at the contracts. But sometimes it is about being brave and saying, I don't think this is right. I'm very much someone who I try not to have regrets or to think about regrets, because what's done is done. So even if I now thought, I wish I saw that contract earlier this year, because then I'd have, you know, I'd know that I'm having a book out next year. I try not to do that, because I just think, well, what's done is done. I made that decision for a reason, and there were valid reasons at the time. In terms of external validation, Dominic, I think that, you know, I reached out to you about doing this because I got 3rd prize in the RNA Elizabeth Goose Trophy in August. And I've been really lucky. I think some of my validation, where I've been making those difficult decisions about agents, book deals, has come from the fact that when I need a bit of validation, I will write a short piece and I'll start entering competitions. And I've had about 7 or 8 kind of award, like wins or placements. And that's usually enough to kind of tell me, you know, keep going, you can write. And obviously hearing from readers as well feeds into a lot of that. When you've got people messaging you through Instagram at 2 a.m. saying, I stayed up, you know, to finish your book. Thanks so much. It's helped me for a difficult time. That's also the validation to keep going.
Okay, great. And we're running out of time. So I wanted to come back to romance, because personally, we are going to be having a romance writing festival. So you mentioned right at the beginning that romance had a bit of a bad rep, but there's change on the horizon. So do you want to talk a bit about your experience writing romance and how that tide is starting to shift?
Yeah, absolutely. Pleased to. Thank you. So when I first started out writing romance, there was a real snobbery in the industry and from readers sometimes about romance. I think it came from a belief that every romance was formulaic and also easy to write. And it's not easy to write romance because you've got to build really, believable character, like three-dimensional characters, setting. You've got to have internal and external conflicts. You've got to have something that is believable for people to think, yes, these two people are falling in love and I want them to be together. And obviously the expectation is, for romance, it's largely happy ever after, or you've got to have the promise of a happy ever after. There are some bits of women's fiction where it doesn't have to be that. It can just be happy for now. So yeah, I think there was some assumptions made. The one thing that's always struck me is that the one thing that I think is that love is universal in terms of the human condition. Many people want love, and they want to have a partner. So I can never really understand this kind of snobbery. And I remember having comments made to me. I remember a friend's husband, when I was talking about, I think I'd submitted very early on, I submitted a short romance to Mills and Boon. And I think it got as far as an acquisitions meeting, which I think I was like 2021 at the time. And I didn't realise that actually that was quite rare. I thought that's what happened to everyone. And then it was only, I took a 7 or 8 year break from writing, went back to it. Someone's like, no, getting into acquisitions is like, 1% of people. And I was like, oh, okay. But back then I still remember this friend's husband saying to me when I talked about writing romance, he was like, oh, it's a lot of cheese. And I was so kind of surprised that he'd say that to me and kind of represent it in that way. I didn't say anything, and I wish I had. So nowadays I'm a lot more vocal. If people make assumptions about romance or writing romance, I'll say, actually, it's incredibly hard to write a compelling romance that people want, they want to read the whole book. But I've definitely seen a shift. I would say that the work that the Romantic Novelists Association has done, one of their core aims is actually to promote romantic fiction, and they've done wonders. They have a conference it used to be every year, and now it's every other year. But they have industry awards, they have events. As I said, they have the New Writers Scheme that I came up through. They have a magazine called Romance Matters. They really, really champion romance, and there's obviously lots of things that come under romance, many subgenres. And we've seen a few subgenres the last year. I mean, sports romance, romantic fantasy or fantasy romance, very spicy romance. They're all really, really popular, and completely that they're really selling well at the moment. Which is where social media, I think, has got a really interesting part to play in terms of the shift that romance has had over the last few years. There's a whole generation. It's kind of primarily 18 to 25-year-olds who are they're devouring romance like nothing I've ever seen, and they go on TikTok and they talk about it, and they put pictures all over Instagram. So I think associations like the RNA, but I think social media, for all the ways that it can feel negative or impactful in the wrong way at times, it's also played a massive part in the romance genre becoming a lot more popular. I mean, romance, though, if you look at some of the stats, romance has always been one of the biggest selling genres. It's just that I don't think people shouted about that fact. But it's been amazing. As an author of romance, it's been great to see the last few years particularly. And like I said, earlier on, it's walking into Waterstones, and it's, seeing a table of romance novels are kind of there almost as soon as you walk in. Years ago, you'd kind of shuffle in and say to, the bookseller, where are your romance novels? And they'd be at the back, tucked away in the corner. But there are lots of shifts. Some of it's also what the publishing industry chooses to do and chooses to champion. It's also things as simple and hard as book covers. It's the way that some of these stories are represented. So yeah, there's been a real shift, and I feel very optimistic about the way that it's heading, which is why I'm so happy to hear you say that you're going to be doing a romance writing festival next October.
And that's what I'm hearing as well in the world, is that romance is having a resurgence. And I was speaking to one of our literary agents that came to the writing festival that said romance is the next big thing. So I don't know whether that's quality or whether it's kind of new, kind of different way of marketing. I don't know, but it sounds like it's on the rise. So that's why we're delighted to be having a romance writing festival in October 2025. So Nikki, thank you so much for joining me today and talking about all the different, like your pen names, your process and romance writing. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And yeah, if anyone ever wants to chat with me about something writing or book related, please track me down on Instagram. I'm an author by the C1207. I'm always very happy to have DMs slide into my inbox and to talk about romance. Thank you.
I shall put your links in the comments or the description of the YouTube video underneath. So to everybody else, thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully see you next time for another video, whether that's a chat with a local writer, author or writer professional, or maybe it's to do with the writing festival that's happening in April, or maybe even see you at one of our networking events, which Nikki talks about. Having a network of other writers is so important. So until then, thank you so much for joining me and take care. Bye.